Welcome. Thanks for joining the Cosmic Cowboy on an adventure, I guess, through scripture or spiritual inquiry. I set my soul in exchange for the flock. Other sheep also exist for me. These are not from this colony, but it is appropriate for me to bring them. They will also hear my voice. All the flock will be one and have one shepherd. That's from the Ancient Roots Translinear Bible, based on the Aramaic scriptures. Not a Greek primist, sorry. There's some beneficial stuff in the Greek. I suppose in Latin too. I haven't really gotten much into that, I have to admit. You see, from my youth, and I'm saying my early 20s, as a Christian, or somebody who claimed to be a Christian, put it that way, I feel more comfortable with that, honestly. I began to see something. So, to back up a little bit, in high school, 13 years old, I went to a Bible camp. And I felt like I was saved then. So, I actually got into the Christian religious culture, didn't drink for most of the time, no drugs or sex or things like that, right? And I am somewhat thankful, and I really want to mention that because I feel like, I might bash what I call what has been called, not just me, this was called in the early 1900s, churchianity. And I listen, when I'm listening to speakers, to teachers, who have some very clever arguments and positions, and they feel that I feel a certain degree of authenticity in their message, though something's lacking. And so I think a bit beyond, and I go, well, what are they pointing to? So they're obviously elaborating on something that's going on, and I think they're not incorrect, but it's what they're positing as the answer. They're positing religious culture, and that has a limited worth. And I can speak to that because although I got through high school with this kind of indoctrination into that culture, I grew up in a dysfunctional family. It didn't really address any of that. There was repression, there was codependence, there was abuse, emotional and physical. And I'm not saying it was just the failure of the church. It was also the failure. My mother, who also, I guess, got saved, she did not reach out. And this is part of that. The message, the Christian message, is that we are all one, and this is, you'll hear this over and over again. Because it is the gospel message is unifying, and you may not hear it as much in me if you're looking at the surface, because I speak against the heretical fundamentalism, the American nationalism that is reared its ugly head under the guise of Christianity, and it makes me sick. At the same time, though, there is a desire, I understand, for something more valuable, something worthwhile, something meaningful that the gospel does hold. But I want us to seriously consider in these other approaches outside of Christianity, which has been called pluralism, as I understand it, that this, in fact, is not so. That he is one God, but that he is, as the Quran states in verse 1, most gracious and most merciful. Now, I did quote the verse from John 10:16. He has other sheep. But the quality that I would suggest for us when approaching those people outside of what we call the Christian faith is in that first chapter of Paul's letter to Colossians, that Christ completes all. That he pulls things together. I've used this, which I think is a revelation of the Spirit. You may disagree. I've used it, I've used it most of my days within this spiritual journey. In my 20s, I saw Christ. I saw this character, this nature. We've got to ask ourselves, because this came to me recently. I was reading John 17. So this is the Son's prayer to the Father. He said that they might be one. Did the Father not answer or just say no to the Son in that prayer? That we might be all one. Because looking at what we call the visible church, I would say no, we have not been one. One must go to the invisible church in order to see even its adequate fulfillment. What is that? Well, surely it's by his name. It's not the logo or the brand given by fundamentalist Christianity. Surely not. His name is the character of the Son, administered by his Spirit. Is this done by intellectual assent to church creeds, dogmas, and generally religious culture? I hope not, because these are sorely lacking, right? And isn't his Son's sorry, I just had to check my phone. Yeah, isn't his Son's oh, come on. Character, God's Son's character, so evident in the highest and most aspiring senses of these other faiths and ways. I know he is the way. But if we read Colossians, he pulls all those ways together as the way. And if we start to see that, we start to see a resounding yes to his people being one. I say this so we can kind of get some perspective. It's not by those who've gained membership in the superficial veneer of Christianity. This is more of what Paul talks about when he says, you guys were saying you're of Paul, you're Apollos, you're of this guru, right? Then of Christ. Also, couldn't Peter's dream be an inclusion not just of the Gentile world, but of this other tribe. That's what I'm talking about. So, when I've talked and wrote before, I try to bring this together under a concept of John's revelation called the remnant. There will be a remnant that will believe in the end time. And that could be just particular to the Hebrew people, but I really think it's expanded here. My feeling is, if God is one who only hears worship in spirit and in truth, and we were to look at the history of so-called Christian church, it would not resemble Yeshua's prayer to his Father much at all. It's full of schism, it's backbiting, it's all what Timothy talks about in the end times. A rivalrous bunch for sure, right? Oh, sure, there was common practices in a certain faith, but that's something that's sophomoric at best. Paul's words kind of ring in my ears on this. It's like, you're not ready for solid food. Meat. I think also in this way that fringe groups like the Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses are right to reject the common conception of faith as being heretical here. Not that theirs inhabits much more, but I've also seen a remnant in them too, right? The biggest reason I've seen for this other tribe, much like reincarnation, and we'll talk about that another day, it's not so much from me and mine, but for a global historical humanity perspective. Those that in the name at least call themselves Christians are a formidable number. I'm not going to refute that over the past few centuries. But I would say that's because of a watered down gospel and the lack of scruples and maturity of its evangelists. Just think about that scoundrel Billy Graham, for example, in the past century, and his emotional plea bargaining gospel. But my problem with, even if we was to count that as those the only ones going to heaven, right? I just, there's so many before that time that would not be included. So if this revelation or uncovering is to be taken seriously, and more to the point, really, the scriptures of God looking at the heart and the fruit, then we see it's precisely the character of his Son in the main heartfelt inquiries over the centuries and the cultures that is his body. That this other tribe is a group that comes to the righteous judge on that day after their good works, and are quite surprised to see not whatever image, Muhammad or whatever guru kind of ushering them in, but the peasant man Yeshua, and him saying, "One down, my faithful servants," to which they say, "We were serving you all along?" To which he answers to them, "As you did to the least of them, you did unto me." Lastly, in my introduction here, I want to give a shout out to UK musician Ren, who kind of inspired me in invoking the Garden of Eden to forward the creation myth of Christianity, Judaism, to a story of responsibility to humanity. I like that. I think we can see Christ in a lot of places. Like I said, I saw him in Judaism in my 20s. And then for another decade, I saw him in a lot of Gnostic writings. Into my late 30s, I saw Christ in yoga and Buddhism. And I want to say, again, I'm not saying mainly, I'm saying there's a remnant. There's people that are following the character of Christ within these approaches. Then I did do a little study in Sufism back then in my 30s, getting into my 40s. In my 50s, I began to develop really this understanding of Christ, how he could be in Islam. And I'm still kind of developing that, understanding that. My 40s was a bit rough time. I mean, I was still seeing Christ in a lot of what has been called the New Age, but I had this deep night of the soul, and so it doesn't come out later like, ooh, this scandalous stuff. I became a bit of a hedonist at that time. And you could say, well, maybe that, maybe what I was studying kind of fed that, and I'm not going to deny that. It may well just have kind of given me a license to sin. But nevertheless, Christ was there. Christ is there. I'm going to stop there because I want to see how this goes. This is a brief excerpt of hopefully what you'll hear in the rest of the other tribe. We're going to talk about individuation next. And that's more of a getting into that Garden of Eden story. All right. Thank you.